for tuning in to the latest episode of I'll Allow It Nevada, your go-to podcast for swift access to Nevada judicial education. I'm Anne Marie Mayu, your host, representing the Supreme Court of Nevada Administrative Office of the Courts, Judicial Branch Training Unit. Our topic for this episode is a view from the bench, with a continued discussion on domestic violence. My admired guest today is Judge Elana Lee Graham from our Las Vegas Justice Court, Department 1. Welcome to the show, Judge Graham.
Thank you, Anne Marie. I am really excited to be here. When you reached out and told me about this podcast series for the Nevada Supreme Court, I thought, one, very innovative. Let's beef up this CLE requirement and general information to the public. And two, now I can tell everybody how cool I am because I've been on a podcast.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, you were pretty cool before, but that's right. That's right. All the cool kids do the podcast. So
yeah, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. You know, before we start kind of into the questions that I'd like to ask you for domestic violence, is there anything, any part of your job, or are there several parts of your jobs that you would like to share with our audience?
Sure. I can just talk a little bit about my background, which is pretty relevant for your topic today. So prior to being elected to the bench, I'm in my sixth year, so the end of my first term. I was a prosecutor at the district attorney's office. And even before then, I was a law clerk or district court for Jennifer Tagliati. And as a law clerk, I was just, starting out my legal career. And the only experience I had with domestic violence was that which was presented in court. And then as a prosecutor, the last 2 years or 18 months about before being elected to the bench, I spent on the domestic violence unit, exclusively prosecuting domestic violence cases. And then as serendipitous as it could be, when I was elected to the bench, they needed somebody. We have 2 full-time domestic violence courts in Las Vegas Justice Court, which speaks kind of to the volume of the problem that we have, at least here in Clark County. They needed 2 judges to fill the domestic violence court assignments. And so my colleague, Judge De La Garza, and I sat for those assignments, and I did that for 24 months. And I think that rounded out all the experience I needed and wanted out of domestic violence.
Wow. So it sounds like you really were engulfed in that topic in particular.
Yeah. And even just reviewing the 2 guests you had on prior, and I think this is a 3-part series on domestic violence, it just, Anne Marie, kind of speaks to the challenge that domestic violence presents for us as a society at large, because yes, we're part of the legal world, but ultimately we're all part of the same human race. And it's a major issue that's really hard to figure out, that has really far-reaching impacts for families and people.
Absolutely. And just, as we learned in the last domestic violence podcast with Melissa Mangiaracina, there is a difference between domestic violence and other violence. And to be able to determine what the difference is, that must be a challenge in itself.
Yeah, definitely. And I think she took the listeners through the kind of variety, if you will, of types of domestic violence. But kind of the overarching umbrella of all that is that 70% of domestic violence in all forms goes unreported. So we're only talking about the problems that manifest through like a call for service, for instance, is what we know about.
Right. And that's an alarming number of not knowing really what's going out there. So besides, the whole trying to kind of figure out, okay, is this actually domestic violence or not through the definition, can you share with us a couple of other challenges that you face as a judge when you are hearing a domestic violence case?
Yeah, it's really interesting, the attitude towards domestic violence and the change in our country, at least towards it, began kind of in the late 90s, mid 90s. And for me, I was a child at the time, but the issue of the O.J. Simpson, Nicole Simpson relationship, and in retrospect, I think that's a really good case study on escalating forms of violence. that, as everybody knows, had the ultimate consequence at the end.
Right.
And it demonstrated a few telltale signs and warnings for victims of domestic violence, especially one which is so prevalent. When a victim tries to leave the relationship is when it becomes the most lethal and the most dangerous. And that's, if you looked at kind of statistically the murders that are reported and solved that have to do with domestic violence, is so much is centered around that factor. When the victim tries to leave is when it becomes the most dangerous. And I guess to answer your question, it's a little bit complicated because as a judge, you're there and you're unbiased and you're waiting to hear all of the evidence.
Right.
And the presentation of however it's going to manifest in court, which a lot of the times with domestic violence, it's not very straightforward. There's lots of recanting, lots of impeaching, but you still carry with you this knowledge that you have through education about what domestic violence looks like and what how a victim may present, including in their testimony. And so striking that balance between impartiality and just having the knowledge of what domestic violence looks like and how that might present, I think is something you really need to be careful with.
I think that in a lot of cases and situations, that is one of the human dilemmas, right? Of taking our experiences and our knowledge and trying really hard to utilize those to make good decisions, but not biased decisions. And
biased. Yes.
Yeah. So I could definitely see that being a challenge.
Right. And not overstepping and not inferring too much, but just from the facts presented, the reasonable inferences that you can make.
Right. Yeah, that would be a challenge. Are there certain steps that the attorney representing the victim, and I don't know if you can answer this, but could take to help the judge understand best what is taking place?
Yeah. So the folks at, for instance, a district attorney's office or any prosecuting agency, city attorney's office, or even an attorney general case, they are, in a sense, representing that victim, but truly that's not who they represent. They represent our community at large. And they are going to have to not just be considerate of who this particular accused perpetrator has victimized in their case, but, a potential next victim. And in the setting of our justice court, at least in Las Vegas Justice Court, where you have, between 75 and 100 cases on a day, and then you get to your prelim calendar, these attorneys who are prosecuting the case might have 10, maybe 15 minutes max to spend with this victim, who most of the time is very reluctant to, one, be there, two, to cooperate, because ultimately they love this person, most of them, and they don't want to see any long-term lasting impact on that person, which is going to in turn impact their life. And so I think the attorneys do a pretty good job down here in Clark County. I would say they have a specialty unit, and so they're specially trained, and they have safe nest victim advocates, which are crucial for them being able to manage the different personalities of the victims.
Okay.
I could say just by exposure of these cases is kind of how the judge understands best. And I think it's a really tall, really sharp learning curve.
So are you conducting all of these? Are you hearing all these cases live, or do you do some virtually?
So COVID was a real test of our Sixth Amendment for our U.S. Constitution. And we have the chapter and section of the statute escapes me now, but we had an administrative order in place, which did allow some remote testimony. Now, because the challenges of COVID are behind us, thankfully, unless for some extraordinary circumstance, for preliminary hearing, where the standard is a little bit lower, it may be allowable, but pretty rare. And in only extraordinary circumstances for a trial, certainly, you're going to have to present in court and testify in person. Now, there are some things that the district attorney's office has enacted and initiated to keep the victim kind of away and outside of the court so they don't have to face their accuser for longer than necessary, and they employ some of those strategies.
Okay.
But ultimately, it's primarily in person.
Okay. Have you ever heard of the court dog program?
I've heard of the court dog program, just in a general sense of like a support animal or a support person, which is not uncommon for a child to have a support person. Typically, it's not like a family member, it'd be like a third party from a victim advocate group.
Okay.
And I think that our local district attorney's office, it's been about 6 or 7 years ago, they were actually in the process of getting a support dog for people to testify, but that never manifested itself.
I wonder why. I'll have to look into that. That intrigues me.
Yeah, for sure.
To think about the comfort that a dog could give. That would be very interesting.
Definitely.
What type of protections are in place in your court to help the victim of a domestic violence feel comfortable appearing before the court?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and one which should be considered more carefully, frankly, by the judiciary, because when I show up, for instance, to the courthouse or the public defender or the district attorney and they walk into the courtroom, that's just a day at work, and nothing about that experience anymore is intimidating or gut-wrenching or nerve-wracking. You may have had that feeling when you were a baby attorney, but the court process for anybody and any witness typically is the first time, and it's really scary. You got the judge up there sitting high with a black robe on. You got the marshal there who's an armed guard. And I think that impact can be lost on us. And so you have that just as a base layer. And then you have this victim who needs to come in and literally point out the accused and describe all of the, things that occurred to bring them there. Right. And so there's the setting alone makes it a bit of a challenge, but it's necessary and it's important. I think that we trust that the district attorney's office hopefully has prepared them for what the inside of the courtroom is going to look like, what direct examination is going to look like, and how you're probably going to feel during a cross-examination, that it's not pleasant, that those are closed-ended questions and you're not allowed to argue, and I'll be able to ask you follow-up questions. And like I said, the victims are able to wait outside of court for as long as possible. And other than kind of briefly explaining the process to the victim in the beginning, I'd say it's just a general overall challenge. Whenever you're a victim of a crime, it doesn't stop at the actual event of the crime. It could be ongoing for as long as this court process might take. And you're never probably going to be made to feel whole, even if there's a conviction, because the suffering kind of continues.
Well, and that kind of speaks to why maybe we aren't hearing about all of the domestic violence cases.
Yeah.
Because it's that fear of, well, where is this going to go? The unknown, right? Not knowing where it's going to go. And then, gosh, is it going to be worth me going through this extra stress and reliving this again?
All of that. And like, we haven't even talked about, the financial impact to the victim, or the fact that the perpetrator is a parent to the child that they share in common, or that child has witnessed this behavior for, could be years. And, what happens if I call or it's getting worse and I don't have anywhere to go? And that's very, very common, Anne-Marie, that you get the victim in court and you read as a prosecutor or public defender or a retained counsel, you're reading this report and it sounds pretty gnarly. It's a very gnarly situation, and which prompted you to call the police. Most people generally, I think, don't necessarily feel compelled to call the police unless they think there's some sort of significant issue occurring at the time that they need help from.
Right.
But then when it's time to go into court and kind of follow up, they kind of feel like possibly they received the help they need at the time because the abuser left the house, or somebody showed up and arrested them and took them away from the house. And it was like problem solved. And so that poses another challenge.
Yeah. I could see them going through that, where, those emotions where it's just very compartmentalized. So that day it was resolved, but that doesn't mean it's not going to happen again.
Correct. And I think, honestly, more often than not, I would say sometimes you see in a domestic violence situation, there's a couple people, you have a bad day, it's a one-off. It's just you lost your nerve, you push somebody, and then, you're horrified by it and you make changes. And then there's kind of the perpetual abuser. There's not a lot of middle ground, not unlike DUI offenders that we see.
Right, right. So repetitive.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see a pattern? Do you see, I believe the word is recidivism. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, recidivism.
Are you seeing that?
Oh, absolutely. You see that a lot in domestic violence. And when you see that somebody is on like an informal probation with you, where they're to stay away from the victim, perform domestic violence counseling, do community service, and then they get rearrested during that probationary term with a different victim. I don't know in my mind if that comes across my desk. Is that good that it's a different victim or bad that it's a different victim? A lot of the time it's the same victim where maybe they're ordered to stay away from. But I'll tell you, and I know as a member of the judiciary, I'm not shifting blame. Certainly we are a part of that, but I think we're just not doing a good enough job in dealing with domestic violence and finding solutions. We're really not.
Well, and it's a tough topic. I mean, it's a tough one to find the solution for, I think, because it changes. Yes. It changes from case to case. I'm sure you've seen a variety.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a lot of literature out there, and something I've read recently is Decriminalizing Domestic Violence by Lee Graham, and that sounds very controversial. And I think in a very perfect world, that sounds like a great idea. But what she talks about in that book is making a total wraparound, community-wide solution to these problems, which, could be, I think, initiated in every area of crime, because a lot of crime is addiction or psychologically based with deficiencies. Sure. And so, no, it's just a big problem with a lot of challenges. Some things that I think are really good. For instance, my sister's a social worker at a local high school here, and a lot of the students there qualify as homeless, and they have a lot of challenges. But they have brought in law enforcement to teach young people about what domestic violence looks like. It's a little bit of what your last guest talked about, that it's not always violent. It's controlling daily activities, controlling your surroundings, putting you in a financial limit, where you teach a young girl, for instance, or, a preteen or a teen. That's not necessarily a show of love. That's a show of power and control. The fact that he wants to know where you are at all times. The fact that he's controlling who you're allowed to hang out with and where you're going and what you're wearing is not love and concern. That's power and control. So to teach those potential future victims early on that is dangerous, and to teach the perpetrator that that's not how we show love, because ultimately we don't know what they're seeing in their own homes.
Right. I mean, I think that's so valuable to let our children and our young adults know what it is that we're talking about and to be aware of it. That's really great that's happening. As we take a short break for a commercial, I have a request for our audience. All Allow It Nevada isn't solely a certified legal education podcast. It's accessible to everyone. Our goal is to engage with communities and offer valuable perspectives on the Nevada judiciary. If you're enjoying these podcasts, please share the experience with your friends and family. Your support means a lot. Thank you. So, Judge Graham, in our last episode, and we've talked about it a little bit, we learned that 70% of domestic violence never gets reported. So besides what we're doing right now, which is we're talking about it and trying to just educate the general public and community, do you have any other suggestions on how to help remedy this lack of reporting?
I guess if I could, before we talk about the lack of reporting, because that's an important one, but I think the way we deal with domestic violence when it does get to court, I think you could kind of catch somebody at a crossroads and try to prevent further, like you say, recidivism with a little bit better approach to getting at the heart of the issue. It's just a matter of resources as that goes. But the lack of reporting, it's very common. When I was a prosecutor, I would meet with a victim and I would say to that person, they'd be very reluctant. They don't want to testify. And so I would just start off saying, how are you feeling? Oh, I'm fine. I really don't want to go in there. And I would say something like, well, what's your concern? I don't want him to go to jail. So, or her to go to jail. I would say something like, do you want them to get some help? Yeah, that would be great. It's pretty uncommon, whether you like it or not. It's just pretty uncommon that a first time or even second time domestic violence abuser is going to be doing jail time as part of a sentence. Most always, the case is going to be negotiated without any jail time up front. Most always, that negotiation, that case is going to be handled with a negotiation that includes domestic violence counseling, some community service, or any other type of treatment, if you will, that's available in that particular jurisdiction. So perhaps there's a misconception, which is why there's a lack of reporting, that that person's going to jail. There's also a lot of shame. There's a ton of shame that domestic violence victims feel. They feel bad that it's happening. They don't want people to know. They feel bad that they're staying in the relationship. They're feeling judged. And I've learned more about domestic violence than I thought I ever would or ever kind of wanted to. And I will tell you, there are domestic violence victims that walk among you and work with you, who you go to church with and might go to the same gym with, and you just don't know it. And the biggest thing that you can do for a domestic violence victim or somebody who you think might be a victim, because I've had extensive conversations with the Safe Nest advocates, is to, as best as you can, make that person feel accepted and that you're not judging them and that there should be no shame attributed to them for being a victim.
Well, and I think that that shame part and the embarrassment probably is, as you said, very common. And one of the things that we learned is, it doesn't always have to be, the violence part doesn't always have to be physical. It can be making the victim feel like somehow it's their fault. So they go around, believing this, that somehow they did whatever to cause this. And so I could definitely see that the shame and embarrassment being an issue that they would carry with them.
Definitely. And I think your last guest used the term gaslighting, and that's something that's been going on for decades, but somebody has finally put a name to it. And that is very dangerous, especially you see it in abusive parenting and in abusive relationships. And what I think could be really valuable is that victim is feeling, whether they know or not, they are alone, completely alone and isolated by design by their perpetrator. And so for a friend or a loved one to just let them know you're understood and what's going on is that's not you. That's not your fault. I know you. I know you don't forget things. I know you don't blame other people. Like, the power and control that an abuser has over their victim is paramount than any other influence typically that victim has at any given time. And so for a loved one to intervene, I think gives that person a chance. But there's a lot of kind of data out there to show domestic violence victims who have finally gotten out, if you ask them what could have been different to get you out of this sooner, there's not really a clear answer. So it's just another really tricky, challenging, hard topic.
Well, and I'm sure a lot of that is because it's different from case to case as well. So can someone who's the perpetrator of domestic violence, can they get help? Can they be rehabilitated?
Yeah, I think that's definitely possible, and that's the goal. I think the problem that we have in our country, a lot of really nasty realities manifest themselves in our court system. And it's the very end of a long line of problems that gets highlighted in our very public judicial system. Disparities in racial justice, for instance, might get highlighted in the court system, or a perpetrator and their abuse of a victim will get highlighted in the court system, because that's the end of the road. The gig is up, if you will, the jig is up, and they've been caught and they've been brought to a very public forum. Well, those problems with that perpetrator, for instance, or, the racial disparities we have in this country started decades ago. So that perpetrator didn't suddenly one day wake up and fall into a system of power and control.
Right.
That perpetrator was probably, typically probably abused at a young age, or saw that in that environment and had some insecurity, which would control future behaviors. And so, yes, I definitely think a perpetrator can get help. I think it's way more complicated and way more complex than our current system and resources are able to handle with kind of the severe perpetrators or the more extreme cases. Because if you're going to appear in front of me for 6 months, you do 26 classes in the comfort of your home, you log on to Zoom, you talk about whatever for an hour with a group of people, and then you're done. That I don't really think can get at the heart of the issue for most people.
So if you were, not you, but if someone were a batterer, these are issues that they've been carrying around with them for many years, probably learned
Definitely.
and comfortable with, and not understanding what the problem is because they may have lived in this situation where this was the norm.
Absolutely. And yeah, just growing up in a house, well, yeah, when there's an argument, mom gets beat up, and that's just the way it is.
Right.
And so that's how I see conflict being dealt with, or screaming and yelling, breaking things. And I mean, we're all a product of our environment, and undoing that is a real challenge. I think it definitely can be done, but it's hard with a current system that we have. And I think we're being asked to shoulder kind of a lifetime of burden or a lifetime of problems that we've had.
And then you deal with the change of what's appropriate and what's not. I mean, I can tell you that for myself growing up, there are things that my parents did, and by no means were they abusive, but that may not be looked upon as okay parenting in today's age. And yet, I look back on my childhood, I'm like, I had a great childhood. I mean, I have no complaints. But there is a change then too in, I think, what's acceptable and what's not.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct about styles of parenting, forms of discipline, and even, how you operate in a marriage. I think that should be a little bit more bright line, but I think you're absolutely correct. And as a judicial officer, that's not really, I kind of have to trust that the prosecuting agency is using some discretion, because I could just say a few things that I've seen as a judge. Maybe a charge was approved as a child abuse. I don't know. I kind of wish-washed in my mind and thought, well, I could see my mom or dad doing that because that's not necessarily inappropriate. If you call your mom or dad the worst name in the book and you get, slapped in the mouth, I don't know. You just don't know. And like I say, the changes in society, you want to get it right, and you don't want to go too far overboard, but you don't want to not take things seriously.
Right. Because it could escalate then into another situation, and it could be even more dangerous.
Exactly.
Well, on hopefully a more positive note, can you share with the audience a few things that you have experienced in a case that have ended positively? Of course, we're not expecting you to give any specific details. But are there a couple things that because this is tough work that you're doing. So there's got to be some rewards out there where you go home and you go, okay, that was a win.
Yeah, I think when I've seen really extreme incidents that result in hospitalizations, broken bones, burns, kidnappings, and ligature marks from being bound and things like that. I know we're talking positive, but when a victim finally, for some reason, gets out before the death occurs, is the silver lining to just an overall bad situation and what snapped in that person's mind. And it's more so, honestly, as in my prior career, because as a justice of the peace, we're merely a stopping point for those more serious felony kidnap, strangulation, substantial bodily harm cases. But when a victim, you kind of see it. You kind of just see the change going on in that moment, that they're tired. They're really, really tired of that life, and they just want out. And I think that's few and far between, but it does happen. And I think that gives you kind of hope for what that person's life can be. It's a new lease on life for them. And then on the back end, you worry about who that abuser is going to go to next. Because what's really frustrating, and you have to be really careful how you look at this and even how I articulate this, very commonly a victim of domestic violence will come into court as the victim, and that particular relationship that they're in at the moment is not the first abusive relationship they've been in, and it most certainly will not be the last. And so somehow getting to the heart of these victims that there is a way to end this and to be in a healthy relationship that doesn't result in some power and control. And changing the victims, like we say, can a perpetrator get help and change? I absolutely believe that, yes. But just as important is getting that victim to that same state of mind, which is going to have the same challenges, because for decades and even into their childhood, they've always been a victim.
Right. And just as the batterer has probably experienced this as the norm, so has the victim experienced that this is a healthy relationship, and getting them to understand, what a healthy relationship is and looks like.
Exactly.
That's, it's that whole preventative piece that, we're missing that, I think, but it's a hard thing to tackle too.
It is, and it's a societal problem, and it's so much of what goes on. As I think your first guest discussed, it goes on in private. All of it, the abuse of the victims and creating kind of a victim, and then the abuse that the perpetrator either suffers or observes and witnesses, and what shapes them.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure it is amazing when you actually do see someone make the decision to take the steps to get out of an abusive relationship. And that certainly is helpful in all arenas of our community. Is there anything else, Judge Graham, that you wanted to share with us before we close out this podcast?
I think the piece that I would leave, and I do hope that general members of our public listen in, is that if you even suspect that somebody might be struggling or suffering or be a victim, as uncomfortable or as weird or as maybe you're wrong and you're worried about offending somebody that might be, I think that victims feel very alone most of the time. And I think it's really important to let that person know that you support them, that you love them, and that you have no judgment of them, and that you're only there to support and help. And that's especially vital. It is vital. It will really, really rip your heart out. When you look at the factual scenarios where domestic violence victims are killed, it's when something does click and they do turn that corner and they do try to leave the relationship. That is the time that the victim needs to be supported the most by you, by their loved ones, by the community at large, because you're saving a life in that really dangerous time period. And that's just something we should all be aware of.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a very, very valuable advice to give just for everyone, because it's unfortunately more prevalent than we realize.
Definitely. Well, and I appreciate you, Anne-Marie, for shedding some much needed light on this really tricky, hard to deal with, difficult challenge for our society.
It's a tough topic. It really is. And I don't, kudos to all of our judiciary who deals with this on a daily, weekly basis. It is not easy, I'm sure. So I want to thank you for being our guest today, Judge Graham, and a big thank you to everyone tuning into this podcast. A couple of quick reminders. For continuing legal education credit, complete a certificate of attendance, email it to jepodcast@nvcourts.nv.gov. Any questions, topics, suggestions, or comments, also email those into jepodcast@nvcourts.nv.gov. We're always eager to hear from our listeners. Stay tuned for more episodes of I'll Allow It Nevada, released every first and third Friday of the month. This is Anne Marie Mailloux signing off. Take care, Nevada.